So this is a Gruul list that I saw Frank Karsten post. Might be their list, might not be. So similar to what I was talking about previously, this is an aggro list that is pretty oriented, I think, around the Esper matchup, and it chooses a lot of its threats to be resilient to Esper's removal. Which is to say, Esper isn't stellar against early creatures, and Esper isn't stellar if the creatures get out of range of their... why can I never remember the name of... Meathook Massacre. So if Meathook Massacre gets kind of out of range because the creature's stats go up too fast, if Vanishing Verse doesn't hit your creatures because they are multicolored, and if Parasitic Grasp isn't a great answer, then Esper starts to fall behind, and when Control's removal aren't answering things on curve is when Control tends to lose. So this list is picking up a lot of multicolored creatures, a lot of early creatures that still do damage, but come down below Esper's more effective removal options at 2 mana. The one thing this list doesn't necessarily play around super well at first glance is Parasitic Grasp, because Parasitic Grasp hits Kessig Naturalist, it hits Werewolf Packleader, it hits Rahilda. But the reason I say that doesn't... it seems like that at first glance is that, yes, all of these creatures do get killed by Parasitic Grasp, but I think initially I underrated how valuable it was to have Rahilda and Kessig Naturalist starting the day-night cycle against control decks, because it's very easy for control to do something like, especially if control is on the play, answer your turn 2 Kessig Naturalist or your turn 2 Rahilda with a removal spell, either Parasitic Grasp or, in Rahilda's case, Vanishing Verse, and then not have something to do at sorcery speed, which means that when you go on turn 3 to play Tovolar or Reckless Stormseeker, it's already night, which in Reckless Stormseeker's case is just a huge amount of damage, but also means that now a huge percentage of your werewolves are out of range of Parasitic Grasp. But so that's why this deck really benefits from starting the day-night cycle early, and I do think that because of my experiences with that not mattering as much in Standard, kind of led me to not realize how useful it was in the context of Alchemy. Another interaction here that's kind of weird is that Rahilda, because of what is probably a design oversight, lacks a red color identity indicator on the backside. So after it transforms, it's not a red card, it's colorless. That's actually how the card as written works, and it's how Arena processes it. So it dodges Vanishing Verse on the backside. The other major thing is that the deck gets to play Town-razer Tyrant because it splashes into red, and Town-razer Tyrant remains an incredibly effective way to fight control decks that care about their mana quite a bit. So the sideboard here, I know less about. The thing that's most surprising, I think, to me, is that this list really goes light on Snakeskin Veil, which I sort of understood to be one of the more important cards out of green to fight control, and I don't think that's wrong, but I do think it's interesting that this list decided to move away from that and towards more just hyper-aggressive creatures. So, on the whole of things, this Gruul deck, I think, is probably going to wind up being pretty popular for next week's Arena Open, and if you want to play a control deck, I would come equipped with an idea of how you're going to respond to this kind of a deck. It doesn't, I don't think, have enough 4-drops to make the Disdainful Stroke a viable plan. You might be able to board in Disdainful Strokes, but I wouldn't be too excited about it. Unlike Dragons, where Disdainful Stroke is just an excellent card that hits every real threat in the deck. And the nature of the creature base means that the Vanishing Verse, Parasitic Grasp combo is not quite as excellent as it used to be. I don't have a super direct idea of exactly what kind of removal is going to be best against this deck, but it does make me interested in stuff like lower cost board wipes. It also has a lot of sources of haste, but it seems like a deck that doubled up Cinderclasms could be very good against, although trying to play instant speed board wipes tends to allow it to turn to night frequently, which can be a problem. Yeah, zero removal. It is super dedicated to only being aggro and falling very far behind. So, like, for example, I think this list is awful against mono green. Mono green just is bigger, faster, has better, cheaper removal, well, cheaper than nothing, and gets to invalidate just a huge board state by having one creature that's too big to attack through. I think this list is also pretty terrible against clerics that does the same thing, just makes one big creature, and this deck gets super shut down by one big creature. This deck is super dedicated to beating up on control decks, and like every aspect of the card choice and design is meant to accomplish that, which probably says a lot about why it's not necessarily overloading on Snakeskin Veil, in that it doesn't need to if everything is a threat. My guess is probably that against a control deck, this deck probably like trims, my guess would be Ranger class and possibly Arsonist for like the one Snakeskin Veil and maybe one Outland Liberator or something like that. And I think that's all it super needs to do. The rest of the choices: Brittle Blast, Arlinn, Avabruck Caretaker, Tangletrap, Thundering Rebuke, Burning Hands, Flame Blast Bolt. All different types of removal, pretty much, or stuff that goes over mid-range matchups. I don't necessarily know how to feel about that, but in general, I think that if this deck picks up popularity, and I expect it will, the major result will be that Control has a harder time, and aggro decks that go slightly bigger, slightly more towards the mid-range side of the scale, will be happy. What I definitely don't know is how this deck pairs against the various brushstroke decks. Maybe it goes fast enough that it can get over the top of them, and Tovolar giving Trample is pretty nice there. But I found that to be a slightly difficult matchup with mono green, and I don't know that I straight out of the gate see anything in this deck that makes me think it's got a better time there than mono green does.